All right, for more, we are joined by Melanie O'Brien. She's a visiting professor at Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at University of Minnesota. Professor O'Brien, thank you very much for joining us. So firstly, I know it's very early on, but what's your assessment of the claim put forward by South Africa? Do they stand a chance of winning its case against Israel?
It's difficult to say at this point about the case overall because it's going to be a long time before we get to what's known as the merits stage of this case, which is where the International Court of Justice would decide on whether Israel has breached the Genocide Convention. That's probably years away. At this point, where we are in the proceedings is called provisional measures. So this is otherwise known in other courts as interim orders. And this is where South Africa is asking the International Court of Justice to order Israel to cease any conduct that may possibly be in breach of the Genocide Convention. And I think in this case, they have a good argument at this stage of the case, and it is likely that the ICJ will order some kind of measures that Israel should comply with.
Prof. O'Brien, can you help us understand why South Africa filed this request in the first place? I mean, it's not immediately obvious why it would be the country to do so.
This question was also asked about the Gambia when they filed a case against Myanmar in the court alleging breaches of the Genocide Convention. And what's really important that came out of that case, which is also applicable in this case, is that the Genocide Convention protects rights, so the right to be free from genocide, and it gives obligations to prevent and punish genocide on all of the states who are party to that convention. And the International Court of Justice has emphasised that any state that is a party to the Genocide Convention can bring a case under that convention because of the seriousness of what is covered by that convention and because it's so important globally to protect that need to prevent and punish genocide. So South Africa is bringing it as a party to the convention because they have a right to do it. But what's really interesting is that they are also arguing that they are doing this as part of their own obligation to prevent genocide under that convention. So they're arguing that because they have that obligation, but to carry that out, they're actually taking this legal action against Israel. The other connection that South Africa has is its own history of apartheid. And so that is its kind of personal connection, in a sense, to the subject matter of the case. And it sees it as part of its role to prevent that elsewhere going forward.
So based on similar cases that's been filed before, Professor, what are the possible outcomes here?
At this stage, we're looking at whether or not the court will order these interim orders, these provisional measures, which what South Africa has requested essentially is for Israel to stop its military actions in Gaza and to stop any kind of conduct that could be seen as falling within the Genocide Convention. So in other words, essentially the commission of genocide and incitement to commit genocide. They've also asked for the court to order that Israel preserve any evidence of crimes, they allow investigation bodies in, and that they report to the court. It is likely that the court will order some kind of provisional measures. The extent of those remains to be seen because, of course, what Israel can argue is that their actions are being carried out in the course of an armed conflict against a non-state armed group. After that, there'll be many more steps in the case to go forward, which will be a long time in the future.
Right. Prof. O'Brien, Israel is one of a number of countries, which includes the US, I should add, that doesn't recognize the ICJ, didn't sign the treaty. So why is Israel sending a robust team led by a former Supreme Court judge and also a top UK barrister?
So every country that is part of the United Nations agrees to be bound by the International Court of Justice as a court that adjudicates disputes between countries. So Israel is part of the UN, so they agree to that. In addition, they are a party to the Genocide Convention, under which, under its Article 9, it specifically provides that the International Court of Justice will have jurisdiction in the case of any disputes under the Genocide Convention. So that's how it is in play. Israel, therefore, is part of this system and has agreed to be part of this system. And even though we see that, a lot of countries don't necessarily comply sometimes, or they don't always participate, countries also do participate. That's actually how international law works and is successful a lot of the time, is this agreement to participate. And the fact that Israel has said it will participate in the hearings this week is a really positive sign. And hopefully, if orders are made, they will comply with those.
It seems like it's going to be a long process, as you mentioned, Professor. So what kind of challenges does the ICJ face in deciding on the case of alleged genocide, especially when geopolitical tensions and diplomatic rifts are involved?
It is a huge case. And as I said, it's going to be a long time before we see the merits argument, which would be where South Africa argues that Israel has breached the Genocide Convention, and Israel obviously argues that it hasn't. And honestly, I don't envy the judges on the court to make this decision, because it's an extremely complex one. It's not as straightforward as other cases that we may see, other cases of genocide. It's a really complex argument, and there's a lot of discussion amongst lawyers at the moment about particularly the need to prove genocide. You need to prove what's called a special intent, and that's the intent to destroy the group. And in this case, South Africa is arguing that Israel has an intent to destroy Palestinians, or at least a substantial part of the Palestinian population. And that's really difficult to prove. And as an example, one of the things that they're using to prove that argument are statements that are made by Israeli leadership and in the Israeli media. And of course, the opposite argument to that is saying, well, they're engaged in a war, and those comments are made about Hamas. They're not made about the Palestinian people. And so therefore, they don't imply an intent to destroy the Palestinian people. So there are arguments on both sides of this that make it a lot more complicated than other cases may be. And so once we see this go to the merit stage in a few years' time, it's going to be a lot of complex arguments that come from both sides of this case.
Prof. O'Brien, help us understand the impact of the United States calling the case meritless.
It's not meritless. And in fact, as South Africa has argued, it is upholding its obligation to prevent genocide under the Genocide Convention. And international law is there for a reason, and particularly the parts of international law that regulate human rights, the protection of human rights, and including those that regulate the armed conflict, so the laws of armed conflict, and also the Genocide Convention. And what they're here for is to protect people. They're here to protect civilians. They're here to protect humanity. And they're really important. And it's really important that those mechanisms are used when those violations occur. So it's really important that other countries actually stand up for those human rights and the protection of civilians. And that's what South Africa is doing. Because we have a case here where whether or not it is ultimately found that Israel is committing genocide, at this point we can argue that there is a risk of genocide. And therefore it's really important to take action to prevent any further escalation of the violence that is going on, but also to stop any current issues that may be related to breaches of the Genocide Convention.
All right, Professor O'Brien, thank you very much for your time and unpacking this case for us. We've been speaking to Melanie visiting professor at Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota.